Alex Albon and Pierre Gasly are two talented drivers that are clearly good enough for Formula 1, but both have been allowed to leave the Red Bull seats. So will Red Bull regret letting Albon and Gasly leave? Let's have a look. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. The Red Bull talent conveyor belt has been critical for so many drivers on the F1 grid. 7 of the current drivers have had their first opportunity thanks to Red Bull-owned teams. As such, there have been many drivers in the past that were deemed to be surplus to Red Bull's requirements, and many have found their own way in the sport after success with the team. Alex Albon and Pierre Gasly are the latest 2 drivers to move on from the Red Bull team, and both have had a turbulent past in the setup, which has seen them both have stints at the top team that were ultimately unsuccessful. So given that context, you might wonder why I would even pose the question of whether Red Bull might regret letting 2 of their young drivers leave the team. But there are 2 main factors that make me think that the question is worth asking, and the first is the context around both of their moves to Red Bull. Pierre Gasly's promotion was prompted by the unexpected departure of Daniel Ricciardo from the top team. Gasly stepped in after just 1 full season in the Toro Rosso. This timeline for progression is not unprecedented. After all, Gasly's teammate Max Verstappen had proved it was possible. But it was important to note that Verstappen is a generational talent, and I believe that his performances in Red Bull in 2016 and beyond created an unreasonable benchmark for other drivers to achieve. As for Alex Albon's move to Red Bull, he had become the least experienced driver to be promoted from the sister team, given he'd competed in just half a season when he was called up to replace Gasly. This afforded Albon an adjustment in the expectations on his shoulders, and looking at a results-based comparison, he did perform better than Gasly, which was great for his career, and subsequently he was kept on for 2020. But beyond the 2020 season, Albon was surplus to requirements as he failed to continue to impress the Red Bull team, and so he was replaced by Sergio Perez. This move was also an important one in the context of this question. 2 academy graduates had failed to succeed in the top team, and so the team looked outside of the academy for the first time in more than a decade. This brings me on to the second reason why I think it's worth asking the question of whether Red Bull will regret letting the pair leave the team, and that is the fact that these 2 drivers are the best prospects that the academy has produced in recent years. So many drivers have had the opportunity to get a race seat coming through the feeder series, and the output has been pretty disappointing in the last few years. Yuki Tsunoda is continuing for his 3rd season in 2023, but he's failed to impress enough to warrant being the driver that would be most likely promoted to Red Bull in the unlikely event that Verstappen or Perez left. Not only this, but Nick De Vries, the driver who's been recruited to replace Gasly, is from outside the driver program as well, and he's already been tipped as the lead AlphaTauri driver for next year by Helmut Marko, despite being the less experienced teammate. So, with the potential future graduates drying up from the Red Bull Junior team, I think it's reasonable to ask if this is the best time to let these 2 drivers leave. However, I think it's important to note at this point as well that Red Bull haven't completely lost out by letting Albon and Gasly leave. For Albon, he technically still has ties to the Red Bull team and is in a position to step back in if required. But with the Thai driver signing a multi-year deal with Williams, you have to wonder whether those ties are just symbolic, or whether Albon would even want to move away from the Williams team where he has thrived in 2022 and is looking likely to lead for the coming years. And for Gasly, his departure from AlphaTauri was unexpected, and it was Alpine that bought out his contract, so from a financial perspective there was a benefit for the team, especially given they'd extended their agreement together into 2023 in June. So that will help the team going forward from a financial perspective. So we've seen the reason why both of these drivers have moved away, and I think it's fair to say that for all parties involved there are positives. But the glaringly obvious challenge for Red Bull is that there is a gap in the seats that should be prepared to step up and join Red Bull if called upon. It's normal for a driver program to go through cycles. After all, you don't want the best driver to be knocking on the door of F1 seats every year, as you would never be able to give the drivers a chance to learn and grow. But having a situation like this one is unprecedented for the Red Bull Academy setup and is a big risk for the team. With the cost-cap world of Formula 1 in its infancy, it's impossible to know how much it could impact the pecking order in the coming seasons. For all we know, Red Bull, with their development punishment for exceeding the cap in 2021, could drop back and be less competitive. As such, a driver like Max Verstappen may want to move to a more competitive team. It must be said though that this is a pure hypothetical, and regardless, it would probably take a few years of poor form to convince Verstappen that a move elsewhere would be worth it. But for the sake of argument, let's say Verstappen left Red Bull. Right now, there aren't any obvious replacements to take that seat going forwards, and sure, that's a risk, but the last time this occurred, the 2 Red Bull options failed. So that could suggest that Red Bull shouldn't be concerned about this risk, considering they ended up replacing Ricciardo with Sergio Perez. But for me, this mitigation also throws up another challenge entirely, as it brings into question the necessity and value of the most successful junior development program in Formula One. It wouldn't be the only junior program at risk in the sport, with Alpine questioning the value of their development setup after Oscar Piastri left them earlier this year to go to a rival team in McLaren. But personally, I think Red Bull's driver lineup is strong enough and stable enough to not be too concerned about this. After all, Verstappen is contracted to 2028 and Perez is contracted to 2024. Personally, I think that both Alex Albon and Pierre Gasly will continue to thrive in Formula One. It's a well-trodden path for drivers who leave the Red Bull program to have long and successful careers in the sport. Carlos Sainz, for example, has seen some great results recently and is well respected in the sport, and personally I think Red Bull will have more regrets about letting him leave the team than these two drivers. And if you want to learn why that is, watch this video next.